very excited to chat with you and talk about this movie. It is, as you talk about a lot and everybody knows, so deeply specific and grounded in the details that feel kind of historic. And I think knowing some of the other movies you've done, that accuracy is like feels like it must be paramount and specificity. Can you talk a little bit about doing that with Orlock himself? Because he's different in this than he's ever been. It's a very different Orlock, and it feels a lot like it's coming from ideas of the period or an era, right?
Yeah, I mean, basically, the vampires of early Balkan and Slavic folklore were, walking putrid corpses, more visually similar to like a cinematic zombie than a handsome, suave, pale Robert Pattinson, and and so then the question that I immediately needed to ask, given who this vampire is, well, what would a dead Transylvanian nobleman actually look like? And so that meant like certain we base the facial features on certain things to make him scary and masculine and noble, but also like on some portraits, and the mustache was like absolutely crucial, uh, for people who aren't into the mustache because they were expecting something that looked more like the iconic Max Shrek look. I get it. But like if with my approach or based on history, there's absolutely no fucking way ever in any possible situation that this guy wouldn't have a mustache. And but that goes down to like all the clothing that he's wearing, his complicated shoes, his hat. It's all based on research. His weird
It
hairstyle.
his hairstyle, his I mean, personally, I loved the mustache. I was surprised though to see it, but I was like, oh, this is. I know when it's with you, it's like I know it's coming from something real. Like it's not just like
Yeah, yeah.
so someday you were like, he should have a mustache, I think. But I'm curious when you talk about the research and the history, like you mentioned some folklore, the portraits, like how deep do you get in? And I know we're just talking about Orlok here, but like from the way the city looks to the way they're dressing to the way like I just assume that it's all coming from some deep research, but is that kind of
No, I mean every single thing is deeply researched and considered, and you're also like trying to, be as yeah, you're always working to be as historically accurate as possible. Like when there is something that isn't exactly exact, it's like in Victorian mourning clothing of the period, there would be like no shiny stuff on the clothing at all, but because a lot of that clothing was going to be worn at night also, we need to be able to see it, and so that was something that was like changed, but it's only like very tiny little things like that. Sorry, I'm getting
no
pinged.
worries.
Anyway, continue. I'm listening.
Yeah, when you are faced with a compromise that has something to do with it's my his vision for the historical accuracy and the groundedness versus it's cinematic and I have to do certain things for a movie and for a movie audience. Like, can you t talk a little bit about when you have to weigh that
That that
call?
that 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 is less of a concern generally, because I think the more that you can like mm, the more that you can defy expectations in the right way, the more satisfying it can be. I think that's like, that's one of the joys to me about doing all this research, is finding things that like are a little bit unexpected, like, perhaps the mustache being like slightly unexpected. But I think, like one small thing again, like the costume designer wanted Orlok's hat to be even larger than it was. and because you certainly see examples like that. And I said, well, if this was a story about like uh Hungarian and Wallachian warlords, like, and every like other character had a giant fur hat, like we could go that big. But because um like this is the only one we're going to see aside from like a more humble version, like in Transylvania,
Right.
like we need to dial it back or it's going to go too far.
Yeah.
But like with the actors, like in Visburg, like we were trying to go with historical hairstyles that were accurate but also flattering. And but Aaron Taylor Johnson went for kind of like a pretty out there hairstyle, and we were concerned that it was going to be too much, but he had the personality and the physicality to like pull it off. So we said, great.
Yeah, that I feel like probably everybody feels safe in the hands because they're like, we're doing this as we're grounding this as much as we can, and it helps commit. Um, when you when you think about horror, I'm curious, what are the horror movies? Because so many of the people who loved this are horror fans. As a fan, as a cinephile, what are the movies that you love the most, or that you've turned to over time and again in horror that you're like, this is just, I think, a masterpiece of horror?
I mean, I've definitely seen the Shining. Like, it's possible I've seen The Shining more than any other movie aside from Nosferatu. And usually when I have and when and I've probably twice found that I have watched The Shining to death and couldn't wring any more out of it, and have still gone back to it to check one or two little aspects. The Jack Clayton's The Innocents was the most influential to this film, aside
Huh.
from Nosferatu, and is a film that I watch quite often.
I would think a lot of people, myself included, would love your commentary track on The Shining at this point. Having watched it a million times, I'd be so fascinated to know what you're looking at this point when you look at it. Um, is there something, no pun intended, you want to sink into, sink your teeth into that you haven't done yet? That's like, because when you go into something, you go so deep and you bring it all out for us, and we get to see things we never. Like I'm thinking, like even with the Norsemen, like it was like we never got to see that world like that. We got to see things. Are there things you want to bring to the surface that are like, this is a place I want to go. This is something I really want to explore.
I mean, for sure. I'm like I've always got a lot of scripts in development. I'd like to make a Western someday. I've talked a lot about a story of a medieval knight that I wrote that hasn't been made. There's lots of great worlds to explore.
I want to see those so bad. I read so much medieval and Western fiction and stuff that like I want to see you do it. Sometimes I think, would someone make a Western that tries to be in the West as much as it possibly can be, so we're not living in convention? Because that's the other
Yeah.
thing with Nosferatu is that we get to experience a vampire story that's not just convention that we get used to, like cinematic convention. We get to experience something that's more like, what are these like I was just taken by the townspeople. Can you talk a little bit about that little stop in the story where he's experiencing, and it's all so alien, but like where did it come from?
I mean, we chose like a region in Transylvania because the different like counties have very different folk clothing, so we needed, and different architecture. So we chose a region and we studied it and we tried to figure out what the architecture and the clothing would look like in that period. But and that's and the innkeeper and the old woman who shows around the inn and the people in the inn are ethnic Romanians. There's one Hungarian passer through. But then there's the Roma camp, and that was very challenging. It was very challenging to cast, and more and much more challenging to understand what they would be wearing in that period, because we have lots of photographs of Calderesh Roma from the 1860s and afterward, but like paintings and engravings and stuff, it's very hard to to find anything.
Yeah,
And
so you
so
got a little gap there you have to fill.
yeah, so you're kind of like, okay, well, if this is what this thing looks like, and this, like, maybe if we rewind it to here, that should, and or sometimes you find, but this hat is there, yeah, hooray, you know, um, and I was working with Florin Iordan, who has a band called Tre Parale, and he's like an ethnomusicologist from Romania, to work on like the music that the Roma are going to perform. And then I was working with Florin Lazarescu on the Romanian dialogue. And then we worked with another specialist on the Roma dialect that they're speaking. It was so, blah, blah, blah.
It's just so cool to hear how much goes into it. I have to wrap. Please make that Western. I'll be waiting. I'm out here waiting. Thank you.